I would say sticking to your vision when it might be easier and perhaps even more successful not to. So I would say that, yeah. That's a simple answer, I guess, easy answer, but something like that. I mean, again, I'm not necessarily saying that I fall into that camp, but I think, men and women who have a strong vision, have a strong sense of some aim and purpose and need, who can fulfill that. And they may not be recognized as great in their time, I mean, there's the kind of obvious greatness where, someone's full of enormous achievements and is well known and popular and all that. But no, there's a kind of strength. I would say greatness is associated with a kind of strength, and it's a strength to endure and have the faith without, the promise without the promise without the guarantee. That's what I would say. Having the strength, have the faith, and the promise without the guarantee.
Welcome to another installment of Behind Greatness by Inspire. It's Luciano here speaking as your host. Thanks for tuning in. Really appreciate your listenership. And I want to, if you haven't already, please do subscribe and rate us on whatever podcast platform you use. We are on every podcast platform, or at least every major one. If you're able to take the time, a few seconds, please do so. It will help the cause. And speaking of the cause, as most of our listeners know, of course, we are a not-for-profit and a charity. So if you're so inclined, you can check out on our website, behindgreatness.org, where you can donate and obviously get your tax receipt. Thought I would include that as per usual. Your listenership, number one, is highly appreciated, and your support in other ways just as much. So let's get to it. Today, we have our next guest. His name is Gary Lachman. Gary is the author of many books on topics ranging from the evolution of consciousness to literary suicides, popular culture, and the history of the occult. He has written a rock and roll memoir of the 1970s, biographies of Aleister Crowley, Rudolf Steiner, C.G. Jung, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, who I think we talked about briefly in the episode with Russell Targ. Maybe we'll get into that too. Emanuel Swedenborg, Uspensky, and Colin Wilson. Histories of Hermeticism and the Western inner tradition. Studies also in existentialism and the philosophy of consciousness, and about the influence of esotericism on politics and society. He writes for several journals in the UK, US, and Europe, including 14 Times, Quest, Strange Attractor, Fenris Wolf, and his work has appeared in the Times Literary Supplement, Times Educational Supplement, Guardian, Independent on Sunday, Sunday Times, Mojo, Gnosis, and other publications. He lectures regularly in the UK, US, and Europe, and his work has been translated into 12 languages. He has appeared in several film and television documentaries and on BBC Radio 3 and 4, and is on the adjunct faculty in transformative studies at the California Institute of Integral Studies. Before becoming a full-time writer, Lachman studied philosophy, managed a New Age bookshop, taught English literature, and was a science writer for UCLA. As Gary Valentine, he was a founding member of the pop group Blondie, and in 2006 was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Lachman was born in New Jersey, but since '96 has lived in London, UK. Welcome to the program, Gary.
Oh, thank you very much for having me on.
I actually have, it's our pleasure, obviously. Before we get into some of the questions I've had for you, two new ones. So you're the adjunct faculty in transformation studies at CIIS. Transformative
studies. Well, I guess it's the idea that the research you do should have an effect on you in some way. You're engaged with it, not only as a research, project, but it has a kind of, well, some spirits. I don't want to say spiritual, some kind of actual, it changes you in some way. So I guess that's the fundamental thing. So it's a kind of different way of engaging with research and study, and it's mostly about things that are about that. So the CIS is geared towards alternative kind of education. So it is open to more psychological or spiritual or meaningful sort of approaches to what can otherwise be just sort of dry, objective, kind of purely academic sorts of things. And I mean, most of the students I've had when I've done these courses, they're actually people that many of them are therapists, or they're in some form they work in the healing arts and disciplines. And I guess that's another transformative work as well. So it makes sense that they would be doing this.
Why did you say healing arts?
Well, I guess there's a combination. I mean, there's all different sorts of things. I mean, I guess there's a certain science in the sense of objective knowledge about things, and then there's another sort of thing. I mean, I would say, and I think most people would say something like therapy, psychotherapy, is more of an art than a science. You have to sort of have a certain finesse about it. Mm-hmm. There's no guarantees. There's no one sort of method that works all the time. Although, some people might say that there is sort of behavioral kind of therapies that do that sort of thing. But so, there's a kind of in between land, with this. So it's not necessarily just a cold. And I'm not saying this, I'm not trying to denigrate science in any way, but it just has a certain kind of objective. One doesn't want to say mechanical, but it's kind of determined. If you do this, this happens. But in the other, it's something that's more of an exchange between the two people involved as well. And again, it's a transformative, kind of experience if it works.
I like this term in between land, this sort of idea. So let's just bring it out a little bit, I guess. This sort of idea of living in or studying in or observing in the in between has become very attractive for me. We had Jeffrey Kripal on the podcast, and he told us that he likes to live in the third plane, where he's neither a skeptic nor a stout believer, and that he wants to observe and understand what he's observing, and believe what he sees. Believes what he sees and tries to understand it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's what the Austrian novelist Robert Musil, his great work, The Man Without Qualities, he called the hovering life, where you don't have to land in any one particular place, and you can keep afloat, as it were, and you're not a true believer, but you're not a skeptic in that way. And I think something similar. I mean, to myself. I mean, it doesn't mean that you don't have strong opinions about things. You do, but you don't necessarily. Some aspects or some individuals that many people have an either or kind of response to. You don't necessarily have to have that. I mean, you can be aware of both sides, the pros and cons, and that just brings them more to life. And myself, it's sort of like, I don't know. I mean, it's kind of a cliche. 3 days of the week, I am a true believer, and the rest, the other 3 days, I question it, and I take a day off on Sunday. So, it's something along those lines. But it's also, I think, it keeps you open to new ideas and new interpretations and new understanding of things, because it keeps the door open to that.
That's also interesting because that you say that, because let's talk a little bit about a part of your past. And I've heard you say this in another interview, or maybe a couple of other interviews. We mentioned at the end of your bio that you played for a couple of years in the group Blondie in the 70s. And it was funny, you said, it was an interesting part of my life, but I did that a long time ago. And then you added something else. So we talked about morphing and changing and turning over, writing a new chapter. You said when you went kind of back to school, you wanted to be a writer. You'll fill in the blanks, obviously.
Yeah.
So you described the situation where you were in class. There's a typical professor who came in, or your typical radical professor came in on a leather jacket. He was all rock and roll, and people were really smitten by him. And you had already opened up for the Stones already in a previous life.
Yeah. No, I mean, that was funny that you do always have, the kind of cool, hip, prof who's with it and all that. And I went back as I was in my late 20s when I went back. This was after playing in rock from 75 to about 82. I mean, I played in Blondie for 2 years in the CBGB days, when before they were known, and that scene in New York, and other bands like the Ramones and the Talking Heads and Patti Smith and Television and many others. Sort of early days of what later became punk. And then I had my own band for a while called The Know, Know. And that was because of my interest in Gnosticism, which is, or gnosis, which is a Greek word for knowledge, but it's this kind of intuitive sort of knowledge rather than episteme, which is the knowledge you acquire through study and research and observation and so on and so on. And then I played with Iggy Pop for a year on two wild and woolly North American tours. Those were the two sex, drugs, and rock and roll sort of tours I was on. And then I dropped out. And as I say in different interviews, and in my book I wrote about this called New York Rocker, My Life in the Blank Generation, I just got too smart. I was reading too much all the time. And I got interested in classical music. And also, the fact that my own band, we didn't get a deal. We were very popular on this bi-coastal in LA, New York. And I put out a 45 and then we put out another 45 back in the day when you did that. Yeah. But we didn't land a major deal. And I just got kind of disappointed that happened, and I wasn't writing songs anymore. So I did a sort of not complete reversal, but I just went in this other direction. And it's usually the other way around. Usually people start out, like someone always said, oh, Sting, didn't he do the opposite? Wasn't he like an English professor? Then he became like a rock star or something like that. And I had these professors, not only the radical ones, but just the regular ones who I liked. And this one professor who did Aristotle, he said, you what? You left a rock band? You left playing rock and roll to come here and study philosophy? And he was like, why? Like, what's wrong with you? But it was like, I mean, in many ways, I see it now as, sorry, I'm going on at length about this, but I see it now as a expression of what a writer who came to influence me a great deal around this time when I was playing and left with Colin Wilson, who's a British writer. Started out as an existentialist, and then in the 70s he got very interested in the occult and the paranormal, and he had a sort of second career writing about that. And we became friends. I actually wrote a book about him called Beyond the Robot: Life and Work of Colin Wilson. He passed away about 10 years ago, in 2013. But he talks about these characters, the outsiders, and how they have just a deep hunger and absolute need for a kind of meaning, a kind of very, very, serious sort of meaning in life. And they often go through these sort of rejections of an earlier self and then put themselves into some, oftentimes very, very almost dangerous situation. Like Nietzsche says, build your houses on the slopes of Vesuvius, live dangerously. This is the way to have that intensity of life, that the intense feeling of life that the outsider seeks. And I think spiritual practices are basically aiming at that. So, but they put themselves into sort of difficult situations or inconvenient situations. And, like Wittgenstein gave away all his money when he went to teach in some godforsaken place in the backwaters of Austria. And others did similar sorts of things because the easy life they felt was somehow preventing them from having this intensity of life.
Right.
So in some way, I think, maybe did I do something like that, unconsciously? I mean, in the other sense, I wanted to learn. I read a lot, but it wasn't organized in any way. I just was very enthusiastic. And then I decided, and friends had said, you read all these books, why don't you go back to school? So I decided, okay, I read a lot, but maybe I need a bit organization, and studying philosophy did that. But it was, I went from, I never was a big pop star, rock star, but I was certainly had a career and was known. And then I'm just, a regular person kind of thing, which is, it may sound a bit, I don't know, egotistical, but it was kind of drop, the lifestyle and standard of living was a drop. And then, but I wanted to do that because I seriously wanted to know, what does Kant actually mean? Or what does Hegel really mean? And I still don't know. I'm working on it, but at least I devoted myself to it for a while.
Well, what I like was the spirit that you said you had when you were 19, when you decided that you were going to go into the rock and roll world, and you didn't know. I'm going to try and bridge this, I think, here. I'm going to try to do it intelligently, but we'll see. But you were living in a storefront in Little Italy in New York, but you said that whole experience was beneficial to you because you didn't have any preconceptions. You did it with and now this is my interpretation. You did it with a sense of freedom and exploration. And when you kind of shifted after that career in your late 20s, it seems like when I was listening to you the first time when we were chatting about it, you did the same. You carried that same spirit of exploration. And you said it took you about 10 years to write the way you wanted to write.
Yeah. It took me 10 years to
30s.
learn. Yeah, certainly. Yeah. I mean, the music, I never actually learned how to play, or I learned as I went along. I mean, the funny thing with me in terms of music is that where I grew up in New Jersey, I knew all these great musicians, these great guitarists and, bass players and drummers. And the drummer in Blondie, he was from the same town in Jersey. And I used to go to see him play when he played at school dances and things like that. So we know each other back to high school. But it's because I was in the right place at the right time. And I also was willing to take the risk. And it was also at a time when being a great musician wasn't absolutely necessary. The early sort of, I said pre-punk and punk days, it was, if you knew a couple chords and you had the attitude and the energy and the drive. And I just wanted to do something creative. I mean, I started writing, poetry as a lot of kids do, and in your teens, and I'm glad none of it has survived. But it later transmuted into writing the songs. But I always had this urge to do something creative, and so I mean, even when I got the guitar, it wasn't like I dutifully sat down and learned. I picked up a chord here, chord there, chord there. I mean, even it's a funny thing I'm learning like lately because I started playing again with people that I've been playing things in the wrong keys, and I didn't know, but it worked.
But it worked.
It works. So I don't care what key it's in. It's give me that. Oh, I can do this with it. Yeah, that's it. Let's go. And and it did, and it sort of learned as you went along. Because when I first played with Blondie, I couldn't really play the bass. I mean, I knew a couple, A or B or whatever, a couple things, but that's all you needed. And then gradually we picked it up. But then the same thing when I went, when I left, when I had read lots of stuff, I read all these books and just indiscriminately reading, anything but philosophy, psychology, but paranormal, the occult and all that kind of thing. I mean, Colin Wilson's book, The Occult, came out in 1971. I read it in 1975 when I was living on the Bowery with Debbie Harry and Chris Stein in the early days of Blondie. And it was like one of these books that were left over from sort of the previous generation. And I had no interest in that sort of stuff, really. But it was he's such a good writer, such a page turner. And he was looking at things like the occult and mystical states and altered states of consciousness and so on, and paranormal phenomena in the context of philosophy and existentialism and psychology and literature. So it also opened up all these things. And really, if you take one of his books like that one, or Mysteries, or some of these other big, they call doorstopper books here, like these big mammoth works, and you follow all the leads he lays out, you get a liberal arts education. You get an education. That's basically what I did. I just read all the books that he wrote about in his books. So I went and got them, found them at used bookstores, and just followed up and just carried on. And, I'm sort of autodidact. And then I went to university, got a degree in philosophy, and then got back, being an autodidact with a little more under my belt.
Sure.
But yeah, I just was okay. And then it took me, I dropped out of music beginning of 1982. I didn't start, I think the first book review I published was in 1991. And this was when I was working at this bookshop in Los Angeles called The Bodhi Tree. And it was a review of Rick Tarnas's book, The Passion of the Western Mind. And he's one of the figures at, the CIIS and all that. And I got a link up with that because he saw the review and he really liked the review. He came into the shop and he asked me to write for a journal he was editing called Revision at the time. I think Ken Wilber had been editing it, and then Rick Tarnas had taken over. So I started writing there, and then gradually, magazine articles, newspaper, some newspaper things, book reviews. But it wasn't until I came here at the beginning of 1996, that was another leap into the dark, that I was determined to not only write, but to be a writer, which is different. If you be a writer, you live by it. So that was sort of what I wanted to do. and my idealism has been bruised ever since. But
your
it's
idealism
tough.
been bruised. That's
It's
great.
it's tough work. But I did it. I wanted to do it. But you have this vision of being a writer, and it's like, yeah, I know what that's like now.
Yeah, if you don't suffer bruises and scratches, you're not living.
Yeah,
You're
yeah.
not
There you
living on the
go.
side of Vesuvius.
Yeah, absolutely. So, into what is it? Into the destructive element, immerse. I think Joseph Conrad says in one of his books, and and the German poet Hilderlin, he says, where there is danger, deliverance lies also. So,
Well, so why do you write?
I have to. But at this point, because I guess I've always wanted to express myself in some way. At first, in some successful way, was did it in songs. But then what I wanted to express had become too big, put it that way, to be able to say it in a 2-3 minute kind of song. And, but then I didn't, I wasn't able to write prose that anyone would read, let alone pay me to do. And that was one of the things too. I mean, because I aim to, sort of place articles in certain journals and magazines. It's about the stuff I was reading about. I mean, one of the first things I did an article about Rudolf Steiner, and then about Swedenborg and other things that later on became books, or Jung, or even Wilson, stuff about him that it became books. But these are, and I also, I know for myself, I need to organize the ideas I'm reading about. I'm reading them, I'm absorbing them, then I need to kind of organize them in my head. Otherwise, they're like that. And then it's like, okay, this is my take on Jung, or this is what I got out of Steiner, and I can, I can sort of organize. So there's a kind of inner, tension and chaos that needs to be brought into a kind of harmony. And so I know that's something that
your need. Sorry for interrupting. Your need for organizing your thoughts and your wonder, it more than just a compunction that you can't explain. And I'm referring to the words that you said because I have to when I asked you.
Well, I mean, it just is like that, because I know if I don't write for a while, I start to get very jittery and irritable, and that's sort of happened in recently, because I finished a big book, sort of February. I delivered it.
Congrats.
And
congrats.
Oh, right, yeah, thank you, and then you usually have a little break before you get something else. But I haven't lined another book up yet, because I have a couple of ideas of things. But then I've got involved playing music again, which is a strange thing, which I never thought would happen. That came out of the blue, and so I've been actually devoting a lot of time to playing. I'm not writing anything new in terms of music, but I'm playing some of the old tunes with the band that does like that. They're a great Blondie tribute band called Bootleg Blondie, and just through a series of chance meetings, I wound up being asked to do a couple of tunes with them, and I didn't think I could play again. And now I'm in the band. We're doing all these shows now. So
you're a student of the esoteric. Why is it really out of the blue?
Well, put it this way. I didn't plan for it to happen, and it wasn't something that I sort of ever thought I would do again. And I actually physically didn't think I could play, just that I did my chops. I didn't have my chops up, but I just, okay, why not? Well, I mean, I tell you maybe it's not. Maybe these things come to you when you need them. I mean, that's the 3 days out of the week when I believe that. The other 3, it's like, why are you doing this? Oh my God, aren't you going backwards, playing, rock music again, and and then so but it's fun, and it's physical, and it's I mean, all this kind of stuff. I mean, the one thing I have been thinking about writing is sort of autobiographical kind of work, or something about to answer the question that people often ask me: how did you get from playing, rock music back then to doing what you've been doing for the last 26 years, as it were? And I don't know is usually my answer. Then I can think, oh, well, why don't I actually try to answer that question? How did it go from one thing to the other? And look at the early songs I wrote. I'm always asking about destiny. Like you just said, song called "I'm Always Touched by Your Presence, Dear," that was a big hit way back when, in the late '70s. But it's about the shared dreams I was having with my girlfriend at the time, and these telepathic sorts of experiences, because we were both interested in that sort of thing. And the opening lyrics is, "Was it destiny? I don't know yet," and I still don't. But I'm open to the idea. I think it's, if you accept it too much, it's too easy. But if you completely reject it, that's also,
That's failing it.
That's failing it too. So there's something I think you need, for me at least, I sort of want to, I said that liminal space, staying on the edge to a certain degree, because we have to make a contribution to it too. It's not just, I will let the way take me. Well, actually, no, you yourself, the choices you make and the investments you make and the energy you bring to it and all of that is part of it too. So if there's lots of people just say, oh, well, everything's a message, and I can't, that happened, so I must do this. And I think, there's a while ago, I think Robert Bly said a long time ago that, some men had got to the point where they couldn't do anything unless they consulted the I Ching. I'm sort of like, well, that, you can't really be like that. That's too much. But denying all those sorts of things is equally unacceptable. And that's why I say my approach to all that sort of stuff, synchronicity and sort of fate stepping in, is a naturalist. I notice it, but I don't go hunting for it. So I keep my eye open on periphery, but I don't go out of my way to try to find anything like that.
Well, yeah, I think if you keep your eye open, so my personal experience, if you keep your eye open for these, what we learn are synchronicities. I think they're more than that, but then you don't need to hunt for anything.
Yeah.
Hunting is
absolutely.
unnecessary.
And your own attitude, and it's something I have to remind myself. Because being a Capricorn, I tend to sort of get a bit, kind of pessimistic is the right word. I am aware of the struggle, put it that way. But I have to know. Well, sometimes you have to sort of make a positive effort to actually consciously say, okay, I'm going to try to just not be Pollyanna chipper sort of thing, but sort of keep a more positive drive in things, because that's the investment you're making in it. I think in a way you have to somehow some way communicate the notion that you feel it's worthwhile.
Yes.
I think that's what it is. You have to somehow, it's worthwhile, and it's always worthwhile. That's what I would say fundamentally. It's is it worthwhile? It's always worthwhile, but you have to remind yourself about that.
Well, right. So it's I was going to say positivity, but that's really I think what that is the spirit of exploration, like always keeping that open, not closing it. And
it's something you're paying. It's worthwhile. So you're paying something. It's something's coming out of you. You can just, I'm just positive. I just radiate positivity. You can do that, but it's the exchange rate's very low. But if you actually you actually have to draw something out of yourself, then that there's a real exchange there. And all these phrases, we pay attention. It's a currency we have. Attention, and we pay it on certain, and sometimes we pay it and we get very good dividends back from the investment we make.
Pay attention, that's gold. So I'm not switching subjects here, not purposely, but right. The Rosicrucians, I figured, you nodding your head, so I figured about the Rosicrucians, excuse me. So I'll let you describe a little bit, but I'm just reading up on them now, now as in recently, but just something I was listening to this morning, coincidentally, before our call here, and you said when you were referring to music, why you're doing music, you said in your moments of self-doubt, you just said, what am I doing here? I'm going backwards, playing music. And the Rosicrucians believed, again, we can establish it here through your in-depth knowledge on it. But what I understand is that they believed also in the power of looking backwards to then understand how you've perhaps been communicating with beings who are helping you with what you don't expect.
Well, when you said Rosicrucian, I mean, I've written about them, but it's sort of the historical kind of context. But what you just said to me sounds like something like Rudolf Steiner, might say, because he does talk about like rukzeyan, like back looking, and he described his system as a kind of modern Rosicrucianism, um, which is well, there's all different sort of definitions of what that means. But the original Rosicrucians, I mean, they actually were well, they were a secret society that no one ever kind of found out who they were. In 1614, in a German city named Kassel, on the cathedral door, there was this kind of notice, and it was announcing the arrival of the Rosicrucians and announcing this arrival of this great change going to take place. Not only in Germany, but throughout the Christendom and all that. And the story was that they were followers of a fellow named Christian Rosenkreuz, who about a century a bit earlier had traveled in the East. He went on the journey to the East, and he went to the Holy Land, and he learned a variety of different esoteric knowledge and so on and so on. And he came back to Europe in order to share it, but no one in Europe was interested. And he gathered a band of followers around him. And they tried to implement, his ideas and so on and so on. And he lived to some ripe old age, 126 or something like that. And then he died, and he was put in this vault. And again, the Rosicrucians are like one of these staples of the modern Western esotericism. So groups like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn would have considered themselves Rosicrucian, and they had parts of their temples and the places where they did the ceremonies were laid out in accordance with how this vault, the Christian Rosenkreuz's body, was put in. And then people forgot about him, and then many years later, some other members of the society discovered this vault again, and then his body was still preserved. It hadn't, decayed, and they found all these wonderful instruments and books and the variety of kind of strange magical objects there. And then this was supposed to be the Rosicrucians who had just left the notice on the door. And they kept asking people to come and join, but nobody could ever find them. And they got nicknamed the Invisibles, because they could never be found. And even famous people like René Descartes, the philosopher, he tried to find them and join them. And Leibniz, another famous philosopher, tried to as well. It later turned out to be what was called the serious hoax, a ludibrium of Johann Andreas Valentine, who was a Lutheran pastor, but he was also a student of the Hermetic arts and alchemy and all that. And essentially what they wanted to do was overthrow the Habsburg rule, the Roman Catholic rule in the Protestant lands, because they wanted, just freedom of religious beliefs, freedom of spiritual beliefs, but they also wanted to bring together the Hermetic sciences with the growing natural science, the rise of what we consider science, and a much more open society, free education. Actually, one of them, a fellow named Jan Comenius in Eastern Europe, he's celebrated as the father of like universal education, and he's one of the first ones to promote the whole idea of everyone being taught, and scholars shouldn't just So any case, but the whole notion, I mean, there's certainly the idea of so it's a kind of how should we say, there's sort of like many things came out of that, and then later historically people would refer to themselves as being part of this Rosicrucian line. And so Steiner, he even gave quite a few lectures about them. But I know he certainly taught this practice, this discipline of sort of reimagining your life backwards. And you can see at different times where, you made a decision, you did this, you did that. And did you really make it? Was it something that, as you say, some higher being may have opened up for you and shown for you or something like that? And no, there's all someone very different, the Russian philosopher P.G. Uspensky, who I've written a book about, and who's best known as a sort of follower of Gurdjieff, but he was a brilliant thinker in his own right. But he had this idea. He didn't talk about reincarnation, but he talked about what he called recurrence, which meant that instead of reincarnating into a later life, you go back into your own life again. If you know the film Groundhog Day, which is the same day being, so it's that, but sort of your whole life. And he said, if you become aware of this, if you become conscious at certain points in the past, certain crossroads, important decisions. If you're aware that last time I did this, and then that happened, you might be able to change it a bit, and then that would change. It's a weird kind of thing because we all, we know now from old films like Terminator and 12 Monkeys, if you go in the past, you mess around with it, it messes things up in the future, and then
Sure.
you get into these time loops. But if you just accept it as a kind of imaginative exercise, it is, and in a way, I feel drawn to that because I'm of an age. I'm heading into my late 60s, and if I don't do this now, I might not be able to do it later on, and maybe going back and playing music again is another way of some part of me saying that to myself. Okay, well, don't. Not that I denied it, but don't sort of put this past, on the shelf somewhere. Maybe this is something, if you do want to write this autobiographical thing, maybe you need to go through this again. So I'm working out a new book in our conversation here. I'm realizing I haven't had a chat like this in a while. So
I want the rights to that, or partial rights. Partial rights. I'll give you something.
I'll put you in the acknowledgement.
Oh yes. Well, I want to bridge what you've just said with breaking out of the recurrence, because you mentioned the robot earlier, and I do want to talk about that. But one last point on the Rosicrucians, because I meant to ask it when I introduced it for you. The name is a compound name, rose and
the rose
crucifix or cross.
Yeah. The rose and the cross. Yeah.
What is the significance of the rose?
Well, it's the rose is, the cross is a symbol of death, but it's also one of resurrection, because Christ comes back. And so the rose in the center is the living heart, coming out of the sacrifice, of the crucifixion.
It could be any other plant. It could be any other flower. Like, why rose?
Well, but it has a whole. Well, I'm sure there's 25 theses written about why that particular is the case. The rose is something very, in Persian mysticism, it's something that's, obviously in a variety of different places. So I don't know why exactly that one. There's some, maybe the blood, it's red, the blood red. I'm sure there's, occult scholars out there who have their finger right on it and, saying, why doesn't this guy know this? But it's even people like Goethe, he talked about that as well. He wasn't a big fan of the crucifixion, and he didn't like the whole idea of the atonement, but he did like the notion of the rose blooming, so something living blooming out of the symbol of death. And I think he even wrote a poem about the Rosicrucians, because he was very interested in alchemy and all of that sort of thing. And so he incorporated a great deal of that, sensibility into quite a few of his poems. And Faust, obviously, is a magician.
I've been reading that the rose could also be. I ask you this because obviously,
it's fine.
You've read about this stuff, and you've spent decades reading and writing on this. So I wanted to get it before I mention this. What I'm also understanding is that the rose can also be viewed as a key to a key to the afterlife, or a key to understanding beyond our human condition, understanding where we exist, and that the different rose and different petals, or the fact that the rose has a certain pattern to it, denotes something more mystical than it just being a flower.
Well, it's there's the Golden Dawn. They would have the rose cross, so the Rosicrucian, and then they have the rose in it. Then they'd have on the petals of the rose, they would have the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and then the symbols for the planets, the 7 ancient planets, and then astrological symbols and all that. Jung, would say it's obviously it's a mandala. It's probably the central mandala in the West. And if you think about the Gothic cathedrals, would they have the rose windows, in Chartres, or Notre Dame, and so it's one of those intuitive symbols that combines many different things. And there's a wonderful Rilke has a wonderful account of this moment of complete serenity and sort of stillness. And he felt it was like the stillness of the interior of a rose. So if you think, before the rose blooms, when it's like that somehow, so it's something that's just, and in Sufi poetry and mysticism, it's something that appears quite a bit too. So yeah, I mean, it's if you look at it, it is, yes, there's many other flowers, and there's different, other flowers. I mean, someone like Swedenborg, for him, it would have an exact kind of one-to-one, meaning. Mm-hmm. So I'm actually later this month, I'm going to Sweden to take part in a seminar on modernity and meaning. It's part of what's known as the Engelsberg seminars, and they take place in this fantastic place. It's the Engelsberg Ironworks outside of Stockholm, that's been turned into a conference center. But they, funnily enough, they've asked me to talk about Swedenborg in Sweden. So I feel like in the UK they have a phrase saying taking coals to Newcastle. It's like it's a place where it's a big mining city, so they don't really need the coal. But what they want me to talk about is what he calls his doctrine of correspondence, and this was a kind of spiritual hermeneutics that he developed. Firstly, about understanding the inner esoteric meaning of scripture. And he wrote this gigantic work, Arcana Coelestia, like the secrets of heaven. And it's his interpretation of the first two books of the Bible. But not only that, but also the natural world. So you say everything in the natural world corresponds with its kind of origin in the spiritual higher realms in a one-to-one kind of thing. So he would say the sun, take the sun, for example. The sun gives us, light and warmth. And that corresponds in the spiritual to the divine wisdom and divine love, So I know he says a rose means something specific. I don't remember on the top of my head like that. So there is these systems, there is a one-to-one kind of correspondence between these things. But coming from a more poetic background, I like the idea of it being a bit more shifting and, not necessarily sort of sign to signified. So someone like Jung would say the symbol of the rose is inexhaustible. We could keep finding more and more things about it. And Ouspensky, in this wonderful account of his called Experimental Mysticism, in a chapter of his book called The New Model of the Universe, he was engaging in a variety of different experiments in order to achieve altered states of consciousness. He got into one profound, deep mystical state, and he kept seeing a rose, and he kept seeing these petals opening and opening and opening and opening, and it was the all. It was the totality of things. If we saw it as it really was, we would see this kind of ever opening, ever unfolding, kind of infinite rose. And so,
if you ever write a song that has the all, please remember me.
Okay. I will.
Wonderful. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
You also said to me the last we spoke, you said we are not as awake or conscious as we could be. Break that open for me.
I think that's the essence of pretty much all spiritual kind of teachings, or teachings of psychological development.
But what do you believe?
I'm sorry.
What do you believe?
Oh, what do I believe? I know that's the case. I know from experience that's the case. I mean, I know more from the sense of being aware of my unconsciousness than from the few and far between moments when I feel, oh Jesus, I'm really awake now, which would happen, and they differ too at different times. But again, it's this intensity of life. Even back in the Gospels, it talks about life more abundant. And that doesn't mean a big family, but it means that feeling of life, feeling of being alive. And, modern teachers, as different as, say, Gurdjieff, who was this enigmatic Armenian esoteric teacher who came out of the collapse of the Russian Empire, World War I, Russian Revolution, Civil War, and wound up in the West with Ouspensky in the 1920s, about 100 years ago now. It's amazing. That's a century ago now that they wound up there. But he and also the German existential philosopher, Martin Heidegger, who's around the same time, contemporary, a little bit of difference, but his big book, Being in Time, came out, I think, 1927. But Gurdjieff says we're asleep. We're not aware of our being. We lack what he calls self-remembering. Our focus is always outside, and we forget just the sheer fact that we ourselves exist. And that always comes back to us as a surprise. And Heidegger said that we suffer from forgetfulness of being. We've lost a sense of being. And they both suggest in different ways, but they get to the same point, that a vivid grasp of our own finitude, the fact that we're going to die, is one way to awaken that sense of being. And you get a sense of urgency, and sometimes I feel like in the middle of the night when I can't get to sleep and I realize, God, I am whatever age and I don't have that much time left and there's so much more to do. And I get that it's more of a panic kind of sense. You can't do much at 3 or 4 in the morning, but there are times, during the day, if it comes to you, we're wrapped up in what Heidegger calls the triviality of everydayness. And then even in ourselves, well, I'm saying there's the outer world, which is all the, it's inescapable. That's why people used to go off to the caves or the ashram or whatever, because unless you can, completely isolate yourself from stuff going on out in the outer world, it's just full of distractions, and even now more and more, with social media and all this kind of stuff. So even with our best wishes, we find ourselves getting wrapped up in this kind of stuff.
The more free we are in a world that has allowed us to share more and to gain more knowledge, the more entrapped we are by the distractions that those tools give us.
Well, there you go. That's it. This is, I think that's the motor. We develop certain things that seem advantages, then they become disadvantages, and then we have to sort of get over that one. But then there's an inner problem, and we said the robot, and this is a term that Wilson developed, and it's more or less the same thing as when Gurdjieff says we're asleep or mechanical. There's a part of us that it's a labor-saving device that we developed as an evolutionary adaptation. And just think of, when you try to learn how to type or to ride a bicycle or learn a foreign language. Initially, you have to focus all of your attention on every little thing. Where is the B? Where's the D? That kind of thing. Oh God, how do I turn the handlebars and da-da-da? What's the translation between French and whatever it is? And that all takes up an enormous amount of our energy and focus and attention and concentration. But one day we've got it, and you can ride the bike, you can type, you can, carry on a conversation. That's the robot has taken over. It's some part of ourselves that it's unconscious. It's not us doing it. We can now decide what we want to type and where we want to ride the bike to, or what we'd like to say in French. But the problem with the robot is that he does his job too well. He takes over doing things that we'd rather do ourselves. When I was a kid, there was a TV commercial for some painkiller, some aspirin, where the wife, the harried wife, was like, really irritated. Her mother was around her trying to, make things better, and she turns around, "Mother, I'd rather do it myself." And so that's, the robot is like that. The robot just, "Oh, let me do this for you. Let me do this for you." And unconsciously, we allow it to happen. It's not like, how should we say it? We don't necessarily decide. But it's just it's a little chink in the machine. It's a little problem, a little bug that we haven't worked out yet. So it's evolutionary. We can learn how to live less on the robot. And in those moments of crisis, in those moments when we really grasp the idea that one day we're going to die, or often if you find yourself in a unfamiliar situation, so the usual things around you that reflect your usual sense of yourself back to you aren't there. So I know it comes to me when I travel. And if I go someplace I haven't been, and whatever, you're walking around, you find yourself sitting at a cafe, and suddenly you think, "Oh, me here. Wow. I never knew I'd be in Budapest," or something. And then you feel more alive. Mm-hmm. So that's you're not on the robot. And that's why, if you lived in Budapest or whatever it is all the time, it wouldn't seem so magical. But the fact that it's fresh and new, the robot, you put the robot and you basically say, "But look, I want to do this myself. I want to enjoy this holiday. So let me do this." And that's why it all seems, new and fresh and all that kind of stuff. So the whole urge for us to have this more intense feeling of life is somehow to get into those states where we're doing it and not the robot. And Wilson devoted 50 plus year long career to figuring that out. And I mean, his books have had, an enormous amount of influence on me.
And you've had influence on me in this, just in this conversation alone, because when you say we are paying with our attention, I mean, it's oversimplifying it, I know, but really that's what it is. It's paying our attention.
Well, I mean, I agree. And it's good metaphors do that. I'm not saying necessarily a great metaphor, but or if you grasp something that you've always said, because we always say, pay attention, pay attention, pay attention. And we don't really know exactly what does that mean? How do I actually pay attention? And you realize, and it's an exchange. You have to give something in order to get it back. And that's the whole essence of something like Zen. It's attention, attention, attention.
You mentioned in our last conversation that you knew Dean Radin, and Dean, speaking of paying attention, Dean Radin was a recent guest on our podcast. A wonderful conversation that we had, eye opener as well. We talked about science, and the science that he practices is the science from the inward. So is studying what's on the inside rather than what's on the outside. Not rather, but we're studying on the inside as a priority. And you told me that you guys know each other. So when I mentioned,
we did back before COVID. We did a sort of weekend event together at the Omega Studios in upstate New York, and he invited me to come and do it, and so I was very happy to do that.
That's right. I have that near Omega Institute. I want to look that up. I made a note to do that, and I hadn't done it. But I mentioned him because we were talking about what he studies at IONS, and they look for evidence for psychic abilities. And so he's explained to us that the evidence so far points to the fact that we all have abilities across the spectrum. And you tell me paying attention, it reminds me of a few stories that you gave. I'm not going to ask you to reiterate all these stories, but you describe these stories as kind of a tap on the shoulder. I thought maybe you could share maybe a couple, the bus stop one, and maybe your son.
All right, yeah. Well, these are the synchronicities, and I mean, that's one of the things that Dean Radin studies, and precognition. And actually, I sent him a copy of a book I did about all this, my own experiences about precognitive dreams in which bits of the future turn up in advance. I don't wake up knowing I've dreamt the future. I only find it out later that day or the next day, because I always write down my dreams and I say, oh, Jesus, I dreamt that. And synchronicities, those odd, meaningful coincidences which seem like someone has somehow arranged things in a way that you can't avoid thinking that, oh my God, who knew that I was thinking of this? And there's one relatively recent, again, it was just before COVID. And I was on my way to give a talk about Colin Wilson to the Theosophical Society here in London. And I was walking, and on the way, I realized as I was passing the local market that I needed something, and I'll just pop in. I have enough time. I'll just pop in and get it. So I did that, and I was waiting in the line, the checkout line, the queue, as you say here, and they had the magazine rack over there, and I glanced over, and they had the magazines arranged so that all I could see of the copy of Vogue was that it was Vogue, and then the headline of their lead article, and I looked over, and the headline lead article said "The Outsider." And I was on my way to give a talk about Colin Wilson's first book, The Outsider, which is a book that made his name in 1956, and it's the study of existentialism, and intense mental states, and creative individuals, and how they don't fit into society, and so on and so on. So I thought, okay, I'm on my way to talk about The Outsider, and all I can see right there, and I couldn't. They were really stacked in there, so I couldn't, get one out, dislodge one copy. So that I could see what it was about, and I had to go. It was my turn to buy my stuff, so I went. But I took a photo of it, and I tweeted it, and I showed when I was at the talk. It's the kind of synchronicity that Wilson himself would have liked. But on the way home, I thought, oh, actually, there is something else I need in the shop. So I popped in, and I thought, while I'm here, I'm going to take a look and see what that magazine articles about, but they had changed the magazines. So they had taken the old issues out and put the new ones in. So I would not have seen it if I hadn't popped in there and then. And that's, I take that as the tap on the shoulder from guardian angel or aliens or whatever, who's ever in charge, saying, yep, we're paying attention to you. You're on the right track. You're doing the right thing. But then some earlier ones was when I was in Munich, and this was some years ago, and I was working on my book about Jung, and my sons and their mom were with me, and they went out during the day. It was in October, it was around Halloween. Actually, it was sort of Halloween time, and they went out for the day, and I was home working. But I also watched this documentary about Jung making his tower at Bollingen in Switzerland off Lake Zurich. It's this fantastic medieval kind of structure that, and he carved many of the stones and so on and so on. And he tells the story that he ordered some stones from a quarry, and one came and it wasn't up to his specifications, and he didn't want it. He was about to send it back, and they said, no, I'll keep it. It's a perfect cube. And he says this that's what he said in the narrator of the documentary. Said this is Jung said, no, I will. It's a perfect cube, so I will keep it. That must mean something, and it became one of the the cornerstone of something. So later that day, my family came back. We were carving pumpkins to make jack-o'-lanterns for Halloween, and my son, who was about maybe 10 at the time, he poked his knife in and pulled something out. And he said, "Look at this, a perfect cube." And he had carved. It was like that, and I thought, a 10-year-old doesn't usually say something like that. I had heard exactly that phrase earlier in the day, about the documentary about Jung. In the book, I'm writing about synchronicities about Jung. So here's, and there's another one where Jung was involved, or at least in my experience of it. When here in London, I was at a bus stop waiting for a bus, and I was rereading an account of Jung and one of his clients. And it was a young man who was thinking of marrying this woman, and he thought he would ask Jung whether it was a good idea or not. And Jung said, well, let's see what the I Ching has to say. The I Ching is the ancient Chinese method of divination. You throw the coin 6 times and it makes hexagrams, and excuse me, and the hexagrams have a certain meaning, and and you ask a very specific, and actually, it's good to ask very specific questions, not very general ones. But so the most specific question is should I marry? Should I get married? And it came up, basically no. This woman's headstrong, and she's too powerful and too willful and dominant and blah blah blah. So Jung said, well, there you go, there's your answer. And I said to myself, boy, I wish I had Jung around when I was wondering about getting married or not, because our marriage failed. And as soon as I thought that, my ex-wife walked off the bus.
Amazing.
So who arranged, who that, you have to sort of figure out how many steps back would that have had to start, for the two strands to meet then. Well, and not only physically, but what was in my head at the time. So
maybe we are just living that illusion, and maybe the tap on the shoulder is not a tap on the shoulder. Maybe that's just the way it is. We see it as a tap on the shoulder.
Possible. I mean, we have to tell some story to ourselves. I mean, what's going, or the story you could tell is that there is no story. That's the sort of bleak existential. Nothing means anything, or everything means everything. But I'm in the middle. Oh, yeah, it does. Maybe it does mean something, and I'm not quite sure exactly what that is yet. But I'll keep working at it.
You're in the in-between land.
Yeah, there you go.
Last question for you, Gary. Thank you so much for your time here. We're coming to the end. I want to ask you this. I ask this of all guests thus far. What is greatness to you?
What is greatness to me? That's interesting. I would say sticking to your vision when it might be easier and perhaps even more successful not to. So I would say that, yeah. Well, that's a simple answer, I guess, easy answer, but something like that. I mean, again, I'm not necessarily saying that I fall into that camp, but I think Yeah. Men and women who have a strong vision, have a strong sense of some aim and purpose, and need, who can fulfill that. And they may not be recognized as great in their time. I mean, there's the kind of obvious greatness where someone's full of enormous achievements and is well known and popular and all that. But no, there's a kind of strength. I would say greatness is associated with a kind of strength, and it's a strength to endure, and have the faith, without the promise without the promise without the guarantee. That's what I would say. Having the strength to have the faith in the promise without the guarantee.
Maybe subconsciously you're fulfilling the promise that that 19-year-old had, living in a storefront and playing music because he wanted to.
There you go. I hope so. Well, it's still going on. So
it's still going on. Gary, thank you so much.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
Hey, it's Enrico Colantoni here, actor, director, and dedicated napper. Like what you heard today, there's more to come. Make sure to subscribe to Behind Greatness and learn about our live events at inspirenorth.com. You'll also find links to our social media right on our website, so be sure to give us a like and follow. Until next time, stay inspired.